At the most recent CrossFit Games earlier this month in Fort Worth, Texas, a CrossFit athlete died from drowning on day one of the competition. This is the first time something like this has happened at the CrossFit Games, and so the entire CrossFit community is absolutely rocked by this development. Worst of all, this appears to be an entirely preventable death that only happened because of multiple points of failure of safety measures at the event. And it seems that there were apparently warnings along the way. And so it won't be long before people start talking about a potential wrongful death lawsuit by the family of the athlete. So the big question here is, can they sue for an athletic competition that he voluntarily went into and for which he undoubtedly signed a liability waiver? And can the organizers here see potential jail time, criminal liability for all of this? Watch until the end, and I want to know what you think. Let's get into it. So to make sure that everyone is on the same page, here's what happened. On Thursday, August 8th, 2024, Serbian CrossFit athlete Lazar Dukic began day one of the 2024 CrossFit Games along with all other athletes that day. The CrossFit Games is a 4-day annual event that brings in people from around the world who compete to be crowned the fittest in the world. In the past, the CrossFit Games have been typically held in Wisconsin, apparently. Anyway, day one was slated to be a 3.5-mile run followed by a half-mile swim in Marine Creek Lake. Athletes would climb out of the water at the end of the swim and cross a finish line before going on to tackle another event. However, as athletes approached the finish line and started to cross the finish line, people started to notice something troubling. There was an athlete who started to exhibit signs that he wasn't swimming forward, but instead was struggling to keep his head above water. Some people tried alerting the lifeguards who were nearby, but then seconds later, the athlete's head vanished underwater. According to a witness that was later interviewed, one person even jumped into the water to try to get to where the athlete went under, but a lifeguard of all people told them to get out of the water. When the person told the lifeguard that an athlete was drowning, the lifeguard apparently casually paddled over to the spot where the athlete went missing and basically paddled to original location, ultimately doing nothing.
You were there when it happened?
Yeah, we were on the side. He was probably 150 meters out in the water. And I saw it. I saw him start to kind of scramble. He started to doing small turns and he was trying to get his head out of the water. And it was at that time that we started screaming to the lifeguard, like, he needs help. And then within seconds he was under and he never came back up.
And I mean, watching the video, you can visibly see the two lifeguards there and him in the middle. It's like,
yeah.
I mean, from our standpoint, it just looks like nothing's being done to save him, but
yeah.
You had a different vantage point.
No, I agree. There was two lifeguards right there. The one lifeguard, because somebody actually jumped in, and the one lifeguard came over and talked to him and told him to get out of the water. But he said, listen, somebody's drowning. She ended up going over to where he went under, but she just did a quick paddle around and then just paddled back out. I feel like at that point she needed to blow a whistle and stop the event, because you could have had a lot more help in there pretty fast. And that was only like a couple minutes after he had gone under. So at that point something could have been done. But once the event's finished, it's 30 minutes gone, right? There's not much you can do at that point.
It was Lazar Dukic who went missing in that moment. Apparently, a mere 50 to maybe 150 meters from the finish line, reports on that distance have varied. Around 7 a.m., apparently a 911 call was made to first responders. Dukic's body was later recovered from the water and he was declared dead at 10:24 a.m., according to the medical examiner's office. Obviously, the police began investigating right away. And then later the same day, CrossFit CEO Don Fall and CrossFit Games director Dave Castro appeared at a press conference. At the press conference, they confirmed that they were cooperating with authorities to get to the bottom of what happened and that they were canceling the rest of the day's events. Ultimately, however, they determined that they wanted to move forward the next day with the rest of the multi-day event. They said that the decision was made after extensive conversations with Dukic's grieving family, who undoubtedly was in shock during these discussions about the events of the day. And the organizers of the event then also said that they wanted the rest of the games to be held in Dukic's memory. Just on a side note here that maybe isn't quite so much concerning the legal aspects here, but more of like the human side of this whole issue. I know that this was a very controversial decision and that there were actually a bunch of athletes who dropped out of the rest of the competition as a result of this decision. Still, though, there were others who maintained that it was what Dukic essentially would have wanted. Whether that's true or not, it does make me as an outsider feel personally a little bit uneasy that they decided to proceed with the rest of the competition, knowing that one of their athletes had literally just died. There's no way that this decision would have been made to actually benefit the family of the decedent, who, like I said, could very well be in shock and denial over the death of their loved one. And there's something about this that just feels a little bit like CrossFit here was more concerned about sponsors and vendors and other aspects of the event's overall bottom line. And actually, come to think of it, this could become legally relevant if it fits into a pattern of CrossFit Inc. essentially valuing profits and other cost savings over other considerations to include safety measures. Anyway, so what happens now? Like I said, the police were investigating what happened almost immediately. And I haven't seen any kind of reporting on an official medical examiner's report, so I don't know if they have completed the examination yet. It's pretty clear that he likely died of drowning, but is there any indication of anything else happening in his body that maybe led to the drowning? It will be interesting to see what comes out of the medical examiner's report if that's ever made public. But this does seem to be a pretty solid case for wrongful death action. So let's talk about it. Now, in any event like this, the first thing that we are going to want to address is a likely liability waiver that would have been signed by the athlete. I would put good money on the idea that Dukic signed one, since basically any athletic competition that you sign up for is going to have one. And when I looked up liability waivers for the CrossFit Games, I couldn't find one for the 2024 Games, but I did find one for the 2016 Games. So assuming that the language hasn't changed in those 8 years in between, here's a bit of what the 2024 liability waiver may have said. I agree and acknowledge that the CrossFit event may involve danger and risk, that the risk of injury from the CrossFit event is significant, that the CrossFit event can be unpredictable, including but not limited to the risk of property damage, serious personal injury, paralysis, rhabdomyolysis, musculoskeletal injuries, cardiovascular trauma, neurological impairment, heart attack, stroke, and even death, falls which can result in serious injury or death due to negligence on the part of myself or other people around me, and injury or death due to improper use or failure of equipment. I understand and agree that neither my actions nor the actions of any other person can necessarily be controlled, and that my safety and health cannot be guaranteed while participating in or observing the CrossFit event and related activities or visiting the venue. Okay, so in other words, the waiver basically says, hey, any kind of negligence, either yours, ours, or anyone else's, you understand that you can't hold us responsible for any of that if it causes some kind of an injury, and that includes death. And then there's another part of the waiver that essentially repeats a lot of the same thing, talking about releasing CrossFit from any liability for negligence, and even if that negligence results in someone's death. Here it says, I hereby voluntarily and expressly agree to accept and assume all risk of loss, damages, theft, injury, or death that may occur to me or my property as a result of or incident to my participation in the CrossFit event, or from any prizes that may be awarded to me in connection with the CrossFit event, including the risk I may be injured by the actions or negligence of the released parties, other participants, or third parties while participating in the CrossFit event or visiting, traveling to or from, or using or visiting the venue. And then there's another part of the waiver that releases CrossFit from liability for injuries to include death as well. So if you look at this, you might be thinking, okay, that's obviously the end of it, right? Dukic likely signed this thing, so his family's not going to be able to sue for wrongful death claim. Well, not exactly. See, these liability waivers are great for giving organizers of these kinds of events protection for liability from negligence, but not necessarily all kinds of liability. Now, what do I mean by negligence? Negligence is essentially where someone has a duty to act responsibly and they breached that duty by doing something irresponsible, and in so acting, they harmed someone else. So there are a number of elements of negligence, so let's go through those. First, the plaintiff in a negligence case has to show that the defendant had a duty of reasonable care. Second, they have to show that the defendant breached that duty. Third, the plaintiff has to show that they were harmed. Fourth, the plaintiff has to show that their harm was actually caused by defendant's act. And finally, the plaintiff has to show what's called proximate causation. This basically is where the plaintiff shows that the harm that they suffered is the kind of harm that would be foreseeable from defendant's act. So just as a quick example, let's talk about an auto collision where one driver did not look over into their blind spot before trying to change lanes and then as a result collided with another driver. And let's say the collision caused the other driver some soft tissue damage to their back. You've got a duty of reasonable care. The driver has a duty to look over their shoulder at their blind spot before changing lanes. Then you've got breach. You've got that driver that did not look over their shoulder to their blind spot before changing lanes. And then you've got the harm. The other driver has some sort of soft tissue damage that now needs some kind of medical care. And then there's the causation. Let's say that the other driver didn't have any back issues whatsoever before this moment, and immediately afterwards is when they started to notice this issue. And then there's proximate causation. Soft tissue damage to someone's spine for getting into an auto collision is the kind of harm that we would expect from that sort of an incident. So that would be a situation where there's a fairly good negligence claim. Now, in the context of a foot race, let's say a half marathon, you can have a situation where the corrals at the starting line get messed up. So people are placed in the wrong corral based on their estimated start time and based on their estimated overall pace for the race. These corrals in any kind of a race help to ensure that you have slower runners that start out towards the back and faster runners towards the front. This is important to help minimize the risk that slower runners get run over by faster runners trying to get around them, and likewise that faster runners don't trip on slower runners while trying to get to the speed that they are shooting for. So if the corrals get completely messed up for any number of runners, you can end up with runners that are tripping and crashing while just trying to get to their desired pace. I use this example, by the way, because it is one of my own personal examples during a half marathon once. And as you can see, I ended up just fine. And in fact, if I'm being totally honest, I was even wearing it as a badge of honor, as something that I've finally done enough races to have had the experience of even crashing. But this is also an example of simple negligence by the race organizer. And when you sign a waiver like this so that you can compete in the race, you waive the right to sue them over this kind of an incident. When the harm is simple scratches like this, it's really not a big deal to be able to sue over it. Like I said, I was totally fine. But what about the current case, Lazar Dukic's case? Well, there are indications here that what we are looking at now isn't actually a case of general negligence. We might in fact be looking at gross negligence. Gross negligence is essentially a heightened degree of negligence. It's where the defendant didn't just depart from the ordinary standard of care, but they did it on an extreme level. Basically, gross negligence is defined as the willful, wanton, or reckless conduct affecting the life or property of another. This means it's where the defendant thoughtlessly disregarded the consequences of the failure to use even slight care to avoid harming the life or property of another person. And so in a gross negligence case, it makes sense that the damages are going to be higher than a normal general negligence case. So why do I bring up gross negligence here? Well, for one thing, when it comes to liability waivers, in most, if not all states, a person cannot waive a claim of gross negligence. So this liability waiver can talk all about, somebody even dying and the family or the estate not being able to sue CrossFit Games or CrossFit Inc. But it doesn't make a bit of difference if there's a case of gross negligence. And here, I think there's already enough information to suggest that Dukic died not because of the general negligence by the event organizers, but gross negligence. Here's why. So let's first talk about some of the things that could have prevented Dukic's death. Almost immediately after reports started coming in that Dukic had disappeared in the water, people on social media started to point out in the video footage Dukic clearly drowning in water a mere 50 meters from the finish line. People with experience as lifeguards, even people who had just worked as lifeguards like in high school, pointed out how obvious the signs were that Dukic was drowning. This is an indication that anyone working at the event with any level of lifeguard training similarly should have seen these signs. And when you look at the video footage of the finish line, you can see that there are two people on paddleboards nearby who, as it turns out, were indeed lifeguards. And earlier in this video, I showed a bit from an interview of a witness who said that someone even tried getting into the water to save him, but was turned away by one of these lifeguards. So first we have the issue of the lifeguards apparently not even paying attention to what they were supposed to be doing. Second, some people pointed out that certain safety standards for a water event like this simply weren't being met. For one thing, this was apparently an 800-meter swim, half a mile long. There are 2 lifeguards here on paddle boards, and I did read reports that there were maybe a couple people on jet skis, but this appears to be far too few safety personnel in the water to be able to respond quickly to this kind of a danger. At the same time, these paddleboard lifeguards also don't appear to have any throwable life preservers on them. So what exactly is the plan for them to save someone if they do see someone drowning? So we already see several huge flaws in the safety plan for this kind of an event. And you have to wonder why this was the case. Looking back again at, say, the decision for the competition to continue after this first day, you do have to wonder if the failure to hire more safety personnel for this event may have had to do with cutting costs. If that's the case, that's a huge problem for CrossFit Inc. and the CrossFit Games organizers. And the thing is, that's not all. Remember how I said that day 1 of the competition was a 3.5-mile run, then an 800-meter swim? Now, there are, of course, competitions out there that merge running, cycling, and swimming. They're called triathlons. But if you've ever watched any amount of any triathlon, you know that it always starts with the swim, then a bike ride, then a run. The swim is always first, and for good reason. By the end of any triathlon, hell, by the end of any race, the athlete is generally going to be exhausted, especially because there is an expectation that the athlete is going to give the race their absolute all so that they can make their best time. I mean, how many times have we seen an athlete collapse either right before or right after a finish line because their body has just completely given out due to their efforts?
He's losing his sense of direction. This is worrying. Oh, goodness me. This is a horrible sight. Jonathan Brownlee has lost it now and has staggered to a stop at the side of the course. And Alistair's stopped to help him along. And Alistair is going to try and carry his brother home. Dramatic scenes in Cozumel as the Olympic champion carries his younger brother towards the podium.
Oh my God, I cannot believe what we are seeing here, Matt. Is this allowed? Is he allowed to help his brother? You know, is that part of the rules? I'm not too sure. We've never seen anything like this before.
Unbelievable scenes. Unbelievable scenes in Cozumel. The Brownlee brothers arm in arm, but it's not by way of celebration. Henry Schumann celebrating. He's going to win this race in Cozumel out of nowhere. But we have to be concerned about the health of Jonathan Brownlee. And they're not even on the final stretch yet. Schumann wins in Cozumel. The brothers are coming home arm in arm to finish in second and third. But Johnny can hardly stand. And Alistair is having to drag him across the line and pushing him home for second. Johnny finishes in second. Goodness me, what an incredible conclusion here.
This generally doesn't happen early on unless there's truly something wrong with the athlete. These moments typically will happen dramatically at the very end. So putting an athlete in a position where they are in fact giving their all and the finish line is basically in water, this is especially dangerous. This is why every single Ironman triathlon starts with the water event, so that people are at their highest point of physical ability in the environment that is the most dangerous. Next, there's the issue of preparation level for an event like this. Notably, athletes that compete in the CrossFit Games, generally speaking, prepare for it by going to a CrossFit gym called a CrossFit box. CrossFit boxes are generally some garage with weights, medicine balls, pull-up bars, boxes for box jumps, rowing machines, that kind of stuff. You know, there was a short period of time where I actually did CrossFit myself. This was during my law school summers, and although I didn't do it for very long, I loved it. Most of all for the education and training for how to properly lift weights and doing something that is a very different kind of workout than what I would normally do before then. But although these are amazing workouts, the accommodations in any CrossFit box are generally known for being a little rough around the edges, and pridefully so. And I've never heard of any CrossFit box ever having access to a swimming pool for part of the workout. And at the same time, the CrossFit Games are also known for having some element of surprise for many, if not all, of their events. Athletes might not know until hours before or maybe the day before an event what exactly they are going to be doing in this event. So that combination of the fact that on the one hand, CrossFit Games athletes may or may not have been swimming in preparation for the CrossFit Games, and then the fact that they may or may not have known that they were going to need to do a swim until hours before or maybe days before, that is another element of danger if the athletes weren't able to adequately prepare for this. Now, in this specific case, apparently Dukic was actually a very experienced swimmer and having spent years playing water polo before starting CrossFit competitions. But even someone with significant swimming experience can get caught off guard if they haven't actually been training for a surprise swimming event going into a competition. And that is especially because of yet another factor of danger that apparently was present here. Remember how earlier in the video I mentioned that the CrossFit Games apparently were previously held in Wisconsin? I guess this was maybe the first time that they were held in Texas, and Texas is much hotter in August than Wisconsin is. And look, I went to law school in Texas. I have been there in August myself. It is not pleasant to be outside in Texas in August for basically anything, least of all an athletic competition. And in fact, the temperatures in August in Texas can be downright dangerous for an event like this. And apparently on this day in particular, it was a hot day, and there was a suggestion that even the temperature of the water was dangerous to swim in competitively. So to sort of sum this all up, you have a race where the athletes have to perform in the most dangerous leg when they are already exhausted. Then you have a race where the athletes may or may not have actually trained adequately for that leg. And then you have a race where the temperatures may have been at a dangerous level due to the geography and time of year chosen for the event. And a race where, on top of all of that, there appears to be totally inadequate water safety personnel present, both in terms of number of personnel and competency of the personnel that are actually there to intervene in the event of an actual emergency. All of this information can be drawn by just sitting and thinking about this for a minute or two. But to make matters worse, it's not like the event organizers didn't know about these dangers. Apparently, there were those that expressed concerns ahead of the 2024 CrossFit Games, and those concerns were apparently dismissed. And some concerns about safety measures have even gone back as far as 2020. Now, the event organizers maintain that they had a fully planned and documented safety plan for this event. But given everything that we can just see from an outsider's perspective, looking at the video footage of the event, you have to wonder what the safety plan actually said. And on top of all of that, although this is the first death that has occurred at a CrossFit Games event, apparently it's not the first time that an athlete has drowned. In 2021, an article from Men's Health talked about how another athlete, Matt Fraser, drowned but survived at the 2017 CrossFit Games, which had the same ordering of events: a run, then a swim. Apparently what happened was that his legs were using up too much of his oxygen to swim at the speed that he was trying to maintain. As the article reads, next thing you know, Brent Fikowski, one of the podium finishers that year, grabs him and pulls him because he was bobbing in the water. He was going to drown, he said. And so the article says that despite almost dying in the water, Fraser still ended up in 5th place after that swim. And so here's the lesson that was emphasized for Fraser's coach, Chris Hinshaw, after Fraser almost died in the water that day. If you run and you get tired, you could stop. But if you swim and you get tired, you die. I didn't know that. Coming from a swimming background, I thought anybody could just float. But that's not the case. So we had to teach him how to swim slow. So here's a CrossFit coach who has a swimming background, who learned in this really scary moment all the way back in 2017 that an athlete isn't necessarily going to float if they get tired in the water. This means the danger wasn't necessarily obvious to someone participating in the event, even if they're experienced in the water. However, this article is in Men's Health magazine. It documents something that happened in 2017, and it was published in 2021, 3 whole years ago. Men's Health may be somewhat niche, but it's a well-known magazine for health and fitness for men. And I personally would have a very hard time believing that even if this hadn't been published in Men's Health in 2021, that the organizers of the CrossFit event wouldn't have heard about this near-death drowning incident in 2017. So why didn't this incident trigger something for the CrossFit Games organizers to look into what happened to Matt Fraser in 2017 and see if there is any way that they can prevent disaster from striking later simply by making a few changes here? After all, it would be super easy to change the order of these events to start with a swim and end with the run. And that's just one of the things that they could have changed to make this overall event safer. This notice, whether it comes in the form of concerns brought by people like advocates in the Professional Fitness Athletes Association, or whether it comes from a prior near-death incident in the water at a previous CrossFit Games event that basically mirrors exactly what happened here, this should have put organizers on notice of the dangers of running the event in the way that they were doing it. And so a really good argument can be made here that they disregarded those unnecessary and totally preventable risks by not examining the things that they could do to make this a safer experience for all of the athletes. And when someone has notice of but disregards the risk that they are creating to the safety of someone else, that's called recklessness. And recklessness puts this whole incident squarely in the category of gross negligence. And the thing about gross negligence is, not only is it a claim that can't be waived by a liability waiver, it is also something that can implicate some potential criminal liability as well. After all, under Section 19.04 of the Texas Criminal Code, manslaughter occurs where a defendant recklessly causes the death of an individual. So in the same way that actor Alec Baldwin saw criminal charges for the on-set shooting death of Helena Hutchins when he was using a prop revolver to prepare for a scene, the organizers of the 2024 CrossFit Games could actually end up seeing some criminal charges for recklessly causing the death of Lazar Dukic. But those are my thoughts. What do you think? Do you think that this is a case that warrants a wrongful death lawsuit by the Dukic family? What do you think about the possibility of criminal liability coming from all of this? Let us know in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this, or at least found it interesting or informative. And if you did, I would love it if you could hit the like button. It does help us with the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you're new here and you want to see more coverage of crazy cases and interesting legal topics, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next video is out. And if you're really enjoying the content and you want to know how to best support the channel and get perks like early access to videos like this one, consider becoming a member of Bike Club. You can join either through YouTube memberships or by becoming a supporter on Patreon. Links to both are in the description below. Otherwise, see you in the next one.